Okay, this is Q&A. So, the floor is open. Yeah.
So, I remember you have this idea that when the fruit is taken from the tree, that it's a diminishment in perspective on the world, or it's a worse framework. The movie metaphor was brought as in someone who knows they're watching a movie, they know the horses aren't real. Whereas someone who doesn't know that they're not watching a movie, they feel like they're going to be trampled to death, and therefore they'll make the wrong decisions because they're seeing a false reality. I heard somewhere before that when an image is black and white, that we have to sort of generate the color in it. It makes us work more. So you have a vision of reality that's for sure inferior to color, because the color has in there more of the true detail. But because you have to make more of an effort to make up for it, then that's something that's worthwhile. That's something that increases the merit on your part. I was wondering if using that framework, that kind of look at it instead of this diminishment of perspective, that there's a way to kind of speak for the decision to kind of fall out of the garden, whether we could bring out a merit on behalf of that choice.
Let me see where you started from. You're talking about the tree of knowledge, and then eating from the tree is a diminishment,
yes.
Not falling off the tree. I'm trying to put the facts together. That's all.
Okay.
All right. So, and all these things you quoted for me. So I do recognize them, and that's already something which shouldn't be taken for granted. I don't always remember everything. So, eating from the tree caused a deterioration in the whole of the creation. Okay, that was point one. Now, sometimes reducing, let's say, the information in the input that you have to deal with, which would require you to provide some of that information on your own, has certain beneficial effects. In the case of black and white photography, you become more involved with the picture because of the fact that you have to produce in your mind the colors that are missing from the actual photograph. And that the benefit there is your psychological involvement. There's a loss also because if you're asked to describe the colors of the objects, some of them you're guessing, you don't know. You don't know them exactly. But the involvement creates a benefit which at least sometimes can be worthwhile. I wouldn't say that because black and white photography requires you to invest yourself more into the experience, that therefore it would be a great benefit to simply everyone become colorblind permanently. I would recommend that. I would say that in a world that's full of color and a world that has many color photographs, sometimes looking at black and white photographs also gives you something which you won't get from looking at the color photographs. I think that's absolutely correct. In the same vein, a book with pictures, let alone comic strips, which treat you like a 3-year-old, can't compare with books where you have to create the picture in your mind. The involvement in the story where you're creating the picture in your mind is much greater. And part of the purpose of literature is to involve you in the lives of other people and for you to experience things vicariously. And there's very little of that going on when you're just, 3/4 of your mind is asleep because it's all produced for you. So I think that doesn't mean we should never use color pictures. There is a benefit. If I had to choose between a totality of color and a totality of black and white, I would choose a totality of color. The richness of the color is certainly greater. Now, then you wanted to say that if that's the case, maybe there is some benefit in eating from the tree of knowledge and being expelled because it then becomes more difficult in certain ways. That is a very difficult question. That's a very difficult question, and it's discussed in the literature because, to make your general description now very specific, there are a lot of ways to put this, described as rectifying evil, finding God where he's hidden. That process is an intrinsically valuable process. from which it ought to follow that the more he's hidden and the more effort that you have to find him, the more you've done. And if God was much more revealed in Gan Eden than he is in our deteriorated world, and if therefore the process of revealing him in the deteriorated world is going to be a much, much grander process, then leaving Gan Eden and living in our deteriorated world means that we do more, achieve more, accomplish more, have more credit, more merit, more self-creativity, and therefore should be a net gain. And that being the case, God's commanding us not to eat from the tree is either joking or it's self-defeating. Because if we follow his command, we're going to lose out on this extra gain. That's the way in which I heard it put decades ago, and I talked to people about it, and we looked in various pieces of literature about it. Recently, trying to remember where I saw this, maybe it was in the Ramchal, maybe it was in the Maharal. Recently I saw some discussion which led to at least a partial solution. I talked it over with my oldest son, and he didn't think that it was totally adequate, but it definitely is suggestive, and I think it helps clarify a little bit. The question that I just asked is based on an assumption. Let's say the amount of concealment in the Garden of Eden is 10%. And the goal is to get to 100% revelation. So you have to overcome a 10% concealment. Now we've failed in the Garden of Eden, and the world deteriorates to the point of 80% concealment. Now, if the goal is to get to 100% revelation, I've got to overcome 80% concealment. That's much more revealing in the hidden. That's much more rehabilitating the evil. That's much more self-creativity because I'm starting from a position of much greater concealment. So it sounds like I'm doing more, accomplishing more, earning more merit, I'm being more self-creative. That's where the question comes from. But maybe that's not the right description of the task. Let's suppose the description of the task is in Gan Eden, you have 10% concealment, that means say 90% revelation, and the goal was to go to 100% revelation. And let's suppose falling into a world of 80% concealment, right? The goal is to go to 70%. Not 100% revelation, but just 70% concealment. In other words, in both conditions, you're only overcoming 10%. You're not achieving the total revelation. You're not overcoming all of it. You're just working under different conditions. But the amount of difference your effort makes isn't bigger. Then you won't have the conclusion that you're accomplishing more and therefore there was a good side to it and all the rest of it. And a symptom of this is something which the Ramchal definitely does say, and that is, let's look at the way the task started and where we are now and what we would have expected. There was a challenge in Gan Eden, tree of knowledge. They failed. We are now, it's like taking a trip on a highway, and because of a failure, you're now threshing around in the forest. Well, what should we do now? What is our responsibility now? You might say, well, you have a double responsibility. First of all, get out of the forest, and then get back on the road and then finish the trip. That would mean I have a double job now. I have to overcome the forest, get back on the road, and then by getting back on the road, I have to face the same challenge that they faced in the Garden of Eden, of the Tree of Knowledge, and this time succeed at that challenge so as to complete the journey that they started. That would be a natural thing to think, but it's wrong. It's wrong. Ramchal says the only challenge that we have is to get out of the forest. That's all. If we get out of the forest and we restore it to the condition of the Garden of Eden, from there on out, it's on automatic pilot. It happens by itself. Our challenge is only under these conditions, not under those conditions. That challenge is beyond, it's not a challenge anymore. That's going to be taken care of because of the effort we make here. So it's not as if it's added on. Now, if it's not as if it's added on, you can also say that the challenge is to do a certain amount here, and once that's done, that's all our contribution is. So it's not sort of numerically speaking, it doesn't follow from this framework that under our condition we'll be doing more, earning more, achieving more, getting more merit. It doesn't follow. It could be equal. And that being the case, because Rochel said, I wanted the 10% to be achieved this way. If you've failed, you'll achieve the 10% that way. Then you could ask why he preferred this way over that way. Okay, that's all. But it's not, certainly not that the framework implies that by leaving Gan Eden, you definitely are going to be doing more, earning more, creating more, having more merit. No, it doesn't follow. I think that was progress after having thought about it, discussed it, and read about it. At least I realized that there's an extra assumption that I'm making there that may not be correct. Yeah.
How much of Bechira actually exists? I know that's a very debated subject, but recently I was taught that there's 3 steps to Bechira. That there's, let's say, the thought process. I want to do this thing. I want to do this action, and there's, let's say, I'm going to do this action, and then there's carrying out the action.
You're studying the Chovos Levavos.
Yeah, and then.
I don't think your definition is right. That's not me learning with somebody else right now. All right, that doesn't matter too much. Anyway, what about it?
So, how much of Bechira is actually our choice if Hashem either way? Hashem knows that outcome that we're going to choose or that's going to take place. Why is it even considered that we have Bechira?
Okay, well, to ask that question, you don't need the introduction of the 3 parts of Avoda in the Chovos Levavos. That's not relevant to that, right? And the Chovos Levavos is a big champion of free will, and he says you have 3 different dimensions of freedom, and you get credit for each one of them separately. Right? So leave the what you want to know is foreknowledge and free will. That's what you want to know.
Right.
There are 2 ways to respond to that problem in our literature. There's a solution to the problem, which is given by Rav Saadia Gaon and the Akeres Yitzchak and the Rivash and others. And there's a way to dissolve the problem, which is given by the Rambam. They're different. They contrast with one another. There could be reasons for preferring one over the other. But those are the 2 treatments that are given in our literature. I can describe them briefly to you, and we'll see how it goes. Let's rehearse the problem, first of all, precisely. What exactly is the problem? As you'll find in the Rambam, in Hilchos Tshuva, and other places where the problem is described in all logical detail. I'm making a decision. Here's how it looks to me. I'm trying to decide whether to do A or B. It's the kind of thing I've done before. Sometimes I do A, sometimes I do B. On this occasion, I think, A has these benefits, B has those benefits. I choose, I'll do A. I say to myself, I could have done B. I chose to do A. I could have done B also. In the past, I've done B under these conditions. This time I did A because I chose A. I had 2 alternatives, both open to me, both possible for me, and I chose one and made it real. I could just as well have chosen the other one to make it real. That's the way free will feels to me. Now, the critic says, Gottleib, are you religious? And I said, there's no other reason I would wear this hat. I must be religious. Well, you believe that God knows everything? Yes, I do. You believe he knows it before it happens? Yes, I do. Now let's see, Gottleib. Just a minute ago, you chose A over B. That's what you did. Do you believe that God knew yesterday what you were going to do? Yes, I do. So yesterday, God knew you were going to choose A. Now tell me, Gottleib, if he knew yesterday you were going to choose A, could you really have done B? What would it mean to do B now when yesterday God knew I was going to do A? To do B now would mean to make God's knowledge yesterday wrong. Do you really have that power? That's not bad, you know. If you can do something to make God's knowledge wrong, you're a pretty tough guy. You know, you've got a lot of cheer and going for you. Right? Clearly, you don't have the power to make God's knowledge wrong, to falsify God's knowledge. God's knowledge is infallible. It can't be wrong. So that means you really didn't have the power to do B. Notice carefully, focus on this. The problem of foreknowledge is not how I did what I did. The problem of foreknowledge is, could I do what I didn't do? No one's saying that because he knew I was going to do A, he pushed me, forced me, caused me to do A. We're not talking about how I did A. We're talking about, did I really be available to me also? Did I have any alternative other than what I did? So, God's foreknowledge yesterday that I'm going to do A knocks out the possibility of doing B, which means I didn't have an alternative. Now, when I think about that, what do you mean? I didn't have an alternative? There was nothing else I could do? That doesn't sound like free will. Free will seems to mean that there are two alternatives in front of me. They're both possible for me. I can make either one of them true, and I choose one and I make it true because I chose it. And the other one, if I had chosen it, that would be the one that I made true. And that picture of free will seems to be contradicted by God's foreknowledge. Again, the crucial thing to focus on is foreknowledge is not a challenge to how you do what you do. Foreknowledge is a challenge to there was something else you could have done that you didn't do. That's the challenge that foreknowledge has for free will. Are we clear so far?
So far, go ahead.
Okay. Now, the solution points out that the problem is based on a hidden assumption under the table that they don't tell you clearly. And once you take that assumption from under the table and you put it on the table, you realize that maybe there's a different way of describing things and the problem goes away. Let's try it again. My picture is I have A and I have B. I could do A, I could do B. It's my decision that will make the difference, and I chose A. And since, in fact, I really chose A, yesterday God knew that I'm going to choose A. Now we ask, could I have done B? Let's think, what am I asking about? In the real world, I did A. And the real world, God knew that I was going to do A. That's the real world. I'm asking about whether there's some other possibility that didn't happen, won't happen, right? It's just what we call today a virtual world, something that you make up. And does that virtual world make sense? So keep in mind that when I'm going to talk about whether I could do B or not, I'm not talking about what happened. I'm not talking about the real world. I'm talking about a virtual world where other things happen and whether that virtual world makes sense. So here's how I go. What about the possibility, what we call in philosophy, a possible world or virtual world in which I do B? What would that world be like? Does it make sense to say that there's this world in which I do B rather than A? And here comes the critic and says, well, listen, what's that world it got in it? What's that world like? Remember, in the real world, yesterday, he knew you were going to do A. So, says the critic, in that virtual world we're thinking about, where you do B, yesterday, you have to put in that he knew A. Now you're going to be in trouble. You got a single world in which yesterday he knows A, and today you do B. That can't happen. So wait a second, hold on. We're not talking about the real world. We're talking about that possible world. Maybe when you think of the possible world in which I actually do B, then yesterday you should put in that he knows I'm going to do B. Who says you put in there that I knows I'm going to do A? Why did you transfer the knowledge of yesterday of A from my world to the possible world? You're thinking about a world in which I do B, which I didn't do in this world. Maybe in that world, the yesterday has in it B instead of A. Who told you to put A in there?
I mean, Hashem knew the possibility of both options?
No. In this world, that he knows all together. But that's knowing possibilities, knowing reality are both knowledge, and he has all knowledge. He has knowledge of all the possibilities, and he has knowledge of the realities. But we're talking about two different worlds. The real world is a world in which the things that actually happen in history happen, and the possible world is something else which didn't happen, won't happen, never be, just we're asking whether it was possible. So now, when I talk about being possible, I say, let's consider the possibility of doing B, and I ask, will that contradict what happened yesterday? Which yesterday? The yesterday in the real world? We're not talking about the real world. We're talking about another world in which I do B. Maybe the yesterday in that other world will have in it B, not A. Who says you should transfer A to there? we're changing the outcome on today's picture from A to B. Maybe when we do that, we should change the yesterday from A to B also, and then there's no contradiction. So once you hear that the critic has got to fill in the yesterday in that possible world, and he fills it in by copying it from here, you can ask, why should you copy it from here? Why? Who says it's the right way to fill it in? Now, I can make it more concrete. Bertrand Russell, who was a lifetime atheist and anti-religious, said, don't try to beat up the religious believer with this problem of foreknowledge of free will, because he has a very simple solution. Imagine God yesterday. I chose today to do A. Yesterday, God knows that I'm going to do this today. How does he know? How does he know that? Well, here's a suggestion. He knows it by taking a sneak peek at the future. Say, come on, peeking at the future? We're talking about God now, right? Not you and not Philip either. We're talking about God. And he can peek at the future. So here's God yesterday. I wonder what Gottleib's going to do tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Oh, there he is. He's deciding between A and B. Let's see what he does. He chose A. That's it. He did A. Now I know yesterday what he's going to do. He gets his knowledge from my action. My action causes his knowledge. If that's what's going on, then when we imagine a world in which I do B, we have to imagine God in that world also sneaking a peek at the future and seeing what I do, and he's going to see that I do B, and therefore the day before he's going to know that I'm doing B, not A, because he gets his knowledge from my action. So this means that the critic has simply made an assumption, which he cannot justify, that when he asks whether I could do B or not, he puts into it, of course, I'm keeping constant the idea that he knows A, and then his knowing A, you're doing B is a contradiction. Who told you to keep that constant? Who told you to put that into the picture? That's the solution, and that solution is logically consistent if, of course, you assume it's appropriate to describe God as observing my actions and thereby getting his knowledge. Some people don't like that. The Rambam in particular is against that tooth and nail. But some people aren't bothered by that. Now, what I'm going to say now, I have said for, 20 years. I saw it basically in the Rivash, but I saw now, I happen to be learning the Derech Chaim, which is the Maharal's commentary on Pirkei Avos. And the first Mishnah of the second chapter, he says what I'm going to say now, word for word. It's as if I had read it, I didn't read it, but it's there, word for word. The descriptions in our literature of God's knowledge are descriptions of seeing. God sees man's actions. God sees the future. They're descriptions of seeing. The vocabulary is vocabulary of seeing. Is it literal? Isn't it literal? He doesn't have eyes and ears. He doesn't have legs and shoulders. Okay, fine. Okay, I know. We all know that song and dance, right? And it doesn't have to be literal and so forth and so on. But that's the description. That's the vocabulary that's used. That is the description of getting his knowledge from the action. So you would have strong justification, and this is what the Maharal says. He states this solution, he states it in very, very emphatic terms, that the literature treats it as God's perceiving it, and since he's perceiving it, then if you had chosen differently, he would have perceived what you chose differently, and it's not going to be any contradiction in thinking, could I have done B? Sure, I could have done B. And if I had done B, then he would have known I was going to do B, because he gets his knowledge of what I do by watching me do it. So that's the solution, which, as I say, many people accept. That's, as I said a moment ago, dependent upon assuming so it's appropriate to talk about God getting his knowledge from what we do. The Rambam, in the Guide of the Perplexed, is against that tooth and nail. He talks about, now of course it was written in Arabic, and I'm not fluent in Arabic, for that you have to talk to Rabbi Matalon. But in the Hebrew translation, it's he pa'alus. He pa'alus means being affected by. And the Rambam says at least 6 times that God is not affected by anything outside of himself. True, I think 4 out of the 6 times he says if he were affected by something outside of himself, he would change we don't allow the idea of God's changing. But twice, he simply says, being affected by is ruled out. It's just not appropriate to speak about being affected by. Well, to say that God gets his knowledge of what I do by observing me do it is his being affected in spades. As we say in Hebrew, bagadol. I do it, and my doing it causes him to know what he knows. So
you're saying Hashem will know, Hashem looking into the future, knowing what you're going to decide.
By watching me decide it.
Meaning to happen in the same moment?
No, I didn't say anything at the same moment. They're going to get in trouble with time talk. Let's leave that aside for the moment. We can do it, but let's leave it as we don't have to do everything all at once. And he looks from yesterday to today, watches me choose A. That's how he knows that I choose A.
Saying he's watching you say from yesterday.
That's right. He's standing here yesterday and looking at today.
Right now he's looking at.
Don't give me right now. I'm not interested in that. Right? That's another now from another time perspective. Let's.
No, I'm saying no. But I'm trying to understand when the wording you're using. Hashem sees
The future.
Hashem sees what we're going to choose.
Yeah, that's it. I don't know why you're avoiding my vocabulary. He sees us choosing.
We're talking about in the current moment, right?
I don't know what the current moment. I mean, I do it when I do it. Yeah, of course I do it when I do it.
Right.
I don't do it when I don't do it. I mean, that's just what we call a tautology, right? Of course I do it when I do it. The moment there isn't going to help you. It's not going to give you any information you didn't have, right? He sees me doing it. He sees me making the choice and doing the action, and that's how he knows the choice that I make and the action that I do. He knows it by seeing me do it, which means my doing it causes his knowledge. Just like right now, if I raise my hand, you know I raised my hand because you saw me do it. My raising my hand gave you the photons to your retina, and that's how you know that I did it, because my action caused you to know that I did it. And that's the model of vision. Vision is I do it, he's watching, and when I do it, that causes him to know what I'm doing. So, if the Rambam is against the idea of God being affected, and this has to be taken carefully because, maybe I'll go into that if we have time later, but all right, just put a note of caution. God shouldn't be affected. Knowing what I do by seeing me do it, and that my action causing his knowledge is certainly being affected by, so the Rambam is going to reject this solution. And indeed, in the Guide of the Perplexed, Part 3, Chapter 17, the Rambam has a long chapter on divine providence, and he's describing there, among other things, one of the Arabic schools of philosophy, and he says, these people believe that God knows everything and also that man has free will, and a little thought will reveal to you that that's a contradiction. Period. So what he says in the laws of tshuva and detailed everything else, but there he says it's simply a contradiction. End of story. So he's not going to accept this solution because he will not accept the idea that God is affected by anything outside of him. His attitude towards the problem is to deny that it's a problem that you can even raise. And he does that by pointing out that for other reasons, we deny that God has any qualities. The qualities with which we describe the world, none of them apply to God. God is beyond, transcendent, infinite if you like. Well, that word has 16 different meanings. He's beyond all conception, all understanding, all description, and particularly has no qualities. So, we're not going to talk about God's knowledge. Knowledge is a quality. He doesn't have any qualities. Oh, don't worry, that doesn't mean he's ignorant. Ignorance is also a quality. We're not going to say he knows, we're not going to say he's ignorant. We just don't, we do something very un-Jewish, just stop talking. Right? You can't talk about God at all. So if our problem was a contradiction between free will and God's knowledge, and we stop talking about God's knowledge, you don't have two things to have a contradiction between them. Because this one, we don't talk about it anymore. That's what I call dissolving the problem. Not solving the problem, but dissolving the problem. You get to a position where you can't raise the problem, because Rambam won't give you the vocabulary to say the words to raise the problem. You'll ask me, well, how does that mean I'm not going to describe God at all? Isn't the literature filled with hundreds of descriptions of God? The written Bible, all 1,000 pages, and the two Talmuds and the Midrash. Don't we have hundreds and hundreds of descriptions of God? Maimonides takes care of that, part 1, chapter 54, where he says we don't describe what God is, we only describe what he does. That we can describe. We cannot describe what he is. Knowledge is something about what he is. We don't describe that at all. So, that being the case, the problem of foreknowledge of free will isn't a genuine problem for the Rambam, because it's based on pretending that you understand something that you don't. Pretending that you can understand what God's qualities are, and that's just a mistake. That's two ways to deal with the problem. Okay, now this is recorded many times. I've done this many times. If you go back too far in history, you'll see when I did it wrong. I used to think there were four approaches. I read the Tshuva of the Rivash, and I realized that he's a much better philosopher than I am, and that's not a surprise. And there are really only two ways to handle it. And by the way, if they tell you that God's outside of time, that's true, but it doesn't help. It doesn't help. It's not relevant to the question at issue. Yes, in the back.
Can I be a partner in business with a Jew who's Mechal Shabbos and works on Shabbos?
Okay, I don't know if I mentioned this clearly, but I'm not an expert in halacha, in law, and it's tricky. It can be done, but it's tricky. There are certain conditions you have to set up to make it permissible. You divide the profits and say, he'll take the Saturday profits and I'll take, a Jew is Mechal Shabbos. A Jew is Mechal Shabbos. That's even more tricky. I don't know. I mean, I know from experience, Jews own shares in companies in which other Jews own shares, and the other Jews don't have to be Shomer Shabbos, and in that sense they're two out of many partners in owning the business, and they're all sharing the profits. So, but I don't know any more than that. It's a very tricky question. Yeah.
So the idea of Yesachas Willen, so just 2 points on that. So you've got Yesachas Willen, say me in Yeshiva currently, I could say I don't think, or I don't know whether I've got the top potential. I'm just giving me as an example, right? To become, let's say, a gadol, right? So maybe for me, you can always say that maybe I won't be able to get a lot of money, that'll be up to Hashem as well, but me put my yeshivas there and work to give it to someone who has necessarily more potential. And another point on that is that that question, if I'm correct, came to Rabbi Eliashib, and he said that yes, but you'll be losing out on this one. Right, that's what, if I'm correct, that's what he said.
Okay, I'd like to see what Rabbi Eliashib said before we talk about what he said. But the question you're asking is a very important question, and it's based on an assumption which I think is an incorrect assumption. Yeshiva, kollel, Torah study is not an investment in Torah scholarship to produce more literary works of Jewish scholarship. That's not what it's about. It's about doing the commandment of the Creator. Is that a surprise? Shouldn't be a surprise. We really should be doing God's commandments, shouldn't we? Now, what is the commandment of Torah? Well, you make a blessing on the mitzvah of Torah every morning. And what it says there is, La soik b'divrei Torah, to occupy ourselves with words of Torah. It doesn't say to understand and to mechadish and new Torah insights and so forth and so on. Is to be occupied with the words of Torah. And the Ramchal Derech Hashem, the way of God, says in his chapter on Talmud Torah that the entire reward that you get for Talmud Torah is the effort that you put in, the hishtadlus, not for the results. Not for the results. And we say when we finish a tractate and we celebrate, I have a long paragraph that the person recites. And one of the things he says there is, we make effort, and those who are not studying and learning Torah make effort. We make effort and we receive reward, and they make effort, they don't get reward. So Chafetz Chaim asked, what are we talking about here? Let's say we're talking about a shoemaker. Now, in those days, a shoemaker made you shoes. You came in, he measured your foot, and he made you shoes. He didn't have 400 boxes of shoes, pick down one to fit you and say goodbye. Okay, so what do you mean? We work and receive reward, and he works and doesn't receive reward? He takes your measurements, he makes you a shoe, you come in and you pay him for it. What do you mean that works and doesn't get reward? Said the Chafetz Chaim. Suppose he takes your measurements and he makes a shoe and it doesn't fit. What then? Well, you don't pay him, right? I mean, it doesn't fit you. You can't wear it. So he worked, he made an effort, but he doesn't get paid. What's the comparison to study of Torah? You sit with your chavrusa for a week on a tosfos, and you bat it out this way and that way, this way and that way, and you don't get it. You don't get what tosfos means. Do you get a reward? Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Because the mitzvah is to be occupied with Torah. The mitzvah is to make an effort to learn Torah. That's the mitzvah. And that being the case, that's what you get. That's the reward that you get. So to say, I'm not going to be a Gottleib, I'm not going to create new Torah ideas or embody total understanding and grasp of Torah, maybe my time in yeshiva isn't worth it, or even is worth less, that's not true. That's not true. It may be, in the best case, that Gottleib is learning 14 hours a day, and you're learning 14 hours a day. He has his background, he has his brilliance, he has his memory, and you have the much weaker resources with which you start. If you're both learning 12 hours a day, you'll both get the same reward. The fact that he turns out great Torah ideas and you don't has nothing to do with the reward that you're getting. And that being the case, the reward is an indication of the importance of the activity to a Kodesh Baruch Hu. So it doesn't follow that you should give up your time in yeshiva for him or for anybody else. And certainly not to say, I'm better off making more money and supporting other people. That certainly, it doesn't follow. There might be other considerations which one could use to it, but the fact that the quality of your Talmud Torah isn't on that high level does not mean that the quality of your mitzvah is worth any less. That's very, very important. Yeah.
We combine the Rambam. And
By the way, I just want to say, if you look at the 26th chapter of the Mesilas Yesharim, the path of the just or straight, he describes the top spiritual level that a person can achieve, which is Hasidus. No, it has nothing to do with fur hats and, and silk coats. And Hasidus is the closest relationship to Kodesh Baruch Hu that you can have. And he says the concept of Hasidus is one, although its expression depends upon your circumstances. And he gives 3 examples. Someone whose whole life is learning and teaching Torah, someone who has an independent business, and someone who's a hired laborer. All 3 of them can be Hasidim in his sense. It's the same concept. It's the same achievement. It's just under different circumstances. Yeah.
So we could say that his actions or his patterns of actions perform the operation of looking into the future to see what I will do, and then maybe altering things now appropriately without compromising that. And then meanwhile, his essence has already set everything in motion to unfold as it will unfold. We say his actions are him, but maybe a distinction we can make between the actions and himself is one, that the actions can be affected and they can shift according to circumstances, but whatever part of him that institutes them, that is the part that is unwavering. It cannot adjust.
Okay, the end of it, I think, is clear. I must tell you, I've taught this for 50 years, and I always say, listen, in the case of knowledge, foreknowledge and free will, we're talking about God knowing. The picture here doesn't involve action, doesn't involve him doing anything. He knows. He could know and be just a passive observer, and the problem will arise just the same way as it arises, right? For God's actions, there are other problems. There are philosophical problems. And maybe, I used to say, maybe if you put together knowledge and action and deal with them simultaneously, maybe there could be another problem. It could be. But we're talking, one second, we're talking only about foreknowledge and free will. And hold on. And I've shown you how to solve that. And I used to say that as a kind of open possibility that I hadn't explored. But in the last year or so, I started exploring it. I think there is another problem. I think there is a problem which is even from the point of view who think that they can solve the problem of foreknowledge and free will, I think the problem of foreknowledge and free action may be insoluble even according to them. That's my current state of thinking, which doesn't answer for tomorrow, but it's my current state of thinking. So you started off now with action. That's a new dimension. And I'm realizing now how tricky it is, and I don't have any settled thoughts on it. I'm thinking about it, but that's why I don't want to get into that, because I think there's a lot that needs to be clarified there. But in terms of what you said at the end, I think that's 100% right. I hinted at it when I said that the idea of his not being affected by is a tricky idea. I sort of made an apology there. I'll tell you now what I meant then. Someone says, well, Maimonides says God is not affected by what we do. What about reward and punishment? What about reward and punishment? If I do a mitzvah, I get a reward. If somebody does an avera, he gets a punishment. So it's my doing the mitzvah that generates the reward, and it's his doing the avera that generates the punishment. Doesn't that mean that he's affected by what I do? And then what the Rambam is saying would be just blatantly wrong. Well, reward and punishment is one of the fundamental beliefs of the Jewish religion. But it's not a kasha, like the Gemara always says, because God has a principle of how he interacts with the world. It's exactly what you said. God has a principle in how he interacts with the world. Let's make it overly simplistic. Mitzvahs get reward, and averos get punishment. And now, when somebody does a mitzvah, he triggers this part of the rule. When somebody does an avera, he triggers that part of the rule, and the rule stays the same. The rule is unchanging. The rule of how to deal with the world is conditional on what conditions take place in the world. And when these conditions occur, they trigger this response. So there's no change in him, because he is the rules, not the responses. So that's exactly right. There's that unchanging constancy that's behind what the events that take place, but the constancy involves rules that are conditional on the circumstances that take place. I think that's genuine. That's really good.
Yeah, and the only thing I left out is that the part of him that is constant, that's generating the rules, that part we can say he doesn't have knowledge. We don't talk about that, so we can escape also foreknowledge on that front somewhat.
I think that's absolutely right. That's the part that we can't describe. By the way, as my oldest son put it when we talked about him with him decades ago, and if you look at the Rambam's vocabulary very carefully, I think the right way to describe it is this: he doesn't have what we call knowledge, but he can do everything that we do with knowledge. He isn't less than we are because he doesn't have our knowledge. He's more than we are, not less. So it's just that, so he can do everything that we do with knowledge. It's just that he doesn't use knowledge to do it. And if you want an analogy, maybe, you know what a synthesizer is? It's a machine that produces musical notes. And although some instruments are a failure, the newest electronic means for creating the sound of violins is recorded violin music. They failed to do it mechanically in terms of the physical analysis. But take a clarinet or a saxophone, which is much easier. The notes are much less rich, and you can do that with a synthesizer, right? Now, somebody doesn't know about synthesizer. Here's the thing: he says, "I hear a saxophone." No, you don't. You hear a saxophone sound produced not by a saxophone, and you don't know what's produced, and you wouldn't understand it if I explained it to you. So the synthesizer can do what the saxophone does, but not the way the saxophone does it. God can do everything that we do with knowledge, just doesn't use knowledge to do it. That's the way to put it, yeah. Yeah.
So this, I mean, it could be a wrong concept, but the idea that Torah, I mean, learning, or whatever learning really means, is one of the most enjoyable things that could possibly, if you do it the right way, I guess, that is possible to have on this earth when we leave us. Would you agree with that statement? So I mean, in my head,
I don't know. You do hear some things like that in some literature, but I'd have to see how it's expressed. It strikes me as overly general.
So I've got to say in my head
saving a life, or Simchas Torah, or a Navi carrying out what a Kodesh Baruch Hu tells him to do. These are inherently less joyous to learning Torah? Could it be so for certain people, maybe, and not for other people? I don't know. Inherently less joyous. We ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to make the words of Torah sweet in our mouths. We don't do that for any other mitzvah. Part of the bracha in the morning. V'harevna, divrei Torah, in our mouths.
Is there something specifically like enjoyable from Torah itself, or is it just like I look at it like you look at a tennis player? I personally hate tennis. Why does he love it? Because that's what he does, and that's what his profession is. Or it could be that's what his profession is because that's what he loves, because he's good at it. Is that maybe just what it is, in a sense, or there's something specific about Torah that actually is sweet?
I think that's probably not a correct way of representing the tennis player. I don't think that if you had his strength and if you had his coordination, and you may very well have the ability to have it or have something similar to it, that you would get pleasure out of it as well. I think it's quite reasonable to think that having the same bodily makeup and the same general psychological makeup would mean that you're capable of similar pleasures, unless something's stopping you, like weak legs or something. That was something else. I think that some literature, like the Tanya, would say that when you're learning Torah, you are absorbing, so to speak, the thoughts of the Creator into your mind. Your whole being now is a vehicle for the expression of the thoughts of Torah. And since your mind is, in a certain sense, the highest part of you, and your mind is totally absorbed into its relationship with Torah, that would produce a very, very specific kind of pleasure. But let me take an extreme example, and I'm saying this partly for the recording, because people are going to think about this. Let's take Moses saying Torah to the Jewish people. Not studying it, getting new insights into it, and so forth and so on, and is described in our literature as Shechina medaberes b'toch grono. The Shechina, God's presence, is speaking through his throat. Is that Talmud Torah? He's the vehicle through which God's words reach the people. I could imagine the joy in that process being greater even than grasping a new Rebbe Kiveger. Maybe some other people disagree with me, but it seems to me that probably. And what about prophecy in general? Having prophecy. Prophecy, says the Ramchal, is the greatest dveikus. The greatest connection to the Kodesh Baruch Hu is prophecy. All prophets other than Moses, when they had prophecy, they lost complete control of their bodies and their minds. I don't think you could be working on the sugya under those conditions. The person say, well, I know the prophecies, at 10 o'clock, but I'm going to base measures, I'll skip it. I don't think so. Doesn't sound reasonable to me that he would do that. I think you have to be careful. There are certain great merits that Talmud Torah has, and there are certain descriptions of its greatness, and you have to know how to read those descriptions, not read them as if you were 9 years old and you took every word literally and simplistically. Things have to be seen in context. There's the famous Nefesh HaChaim about Lishma, and you'll be told that Lishma means studying it to know what it means. And the Nefesh HaChaim says that, and he quotes a Rosh who says that, but it isn't what you hear, because when the Shema is described by the Rambam in the 10th chapter of Hilchos Tshuva as Me'avas ha'adon hayot habore shesiva kain. The Shema means doing it out of love of the master, the creator who commanded it. The Nefesh HaChaim is not disagreeing with the Rambam. No siree. The Shema in every mitzvah is to do it because the Kodesh Baruch Hu created it, out of love of the creator. In addition to that, there's another element in Talmud Torah, and that is to want to know what it says. Not just to be occupied, but the occupation should be an effort to know and understand what it says. And that also goes by the name Lishma. It doesn't contradict the Rambam. Chas v'sholom. Not the Rosh was contradicting the Rambam, and not the Nefesh HaChaim was contradicting the Rambam. And the Talmud Torah has to be done Lishma in exactly the same way that tefillin has to be done Lishma, or tzedakah has to be done Lishma. There's another saying in addition. So you have to be very careful to take what you read and put it in context and compare it with other examples, and to see what, right? Talk about joy. You have Ivdu Hashem b'simcha. All avodah of Hashem should be done with simcha, and you have v'samachta b'chagecha. You have simcha on the holidays. Could there be a special dimension of simcha in Talmud Torah that you don't have in other things? That for sure. That for sure. But you didn't ask about a special dimension. You asked whether it's more than. That's a very tricky judgment. Very tricky judgment. I would be very cautious to say that you could measure,
Is there a special dimension?
Yeah. And I'm sure that it has different descriptions that I'm not aware of, but I gave you the one from the Balatanya. That your mind is united with, so to speak, the machshavas of the Bari. And as the mind is the highest element in what you are, so then it is, it elevates and purifies and connects the mind with the Creator. That you don't have with something else, but isn't the mind. Chazal say, worse is the thought of doing the crime than doing the crime itself. Now, again, see, you have to be so careful. Let's see now. Okay, so on this side I have thinking of doing the crime, and over here I have doing the crime. Tell me something. When you do the crime, you weren't thinking? Of course you were. That's why you did it. So when you do the crime, it includes the thinking. Well, A can't be bigger than A plus B. That's not possible. So it means when you talk about the crime, there's the thinking of the crime, and then there's the doing minus the thinking of the crime. You split it into two halves. When you split it into two halves, the thinking is worse than the physically carrying out, not taking the thinking into account. Okay, fine. Why? Says the Rambam, because when you think, you're polluting the highest element in you. So if you compare the thinking which pollutes the highest element versus just the bodily performance, there's a certain sense in which the thinking is worse because it involves the higher element in you. But that's a dimension. To talk about it globally as being more important than all the other dimensions is very, very tricky, especially since, just to give you a little perspective, there are several different mitzvahs about which we say this mitzvah is equal to all the other mitzvahs. Now, mathematically, that's going to be very, very difficult. A is equal to B, C, D, and E, and also B is equal to A, C, D, and E. That's not a contradiction unless some of them are zero. Right? You can't be both that way. And that's what it said. So it means A is equal to them in one dimension, and B is equal to the others in a different dimension. That's how you solve it. But everything is dimensions. Nothing is global. Nothing is global. My motto is, if you ask a question and get a simple answer, it's wrong. Nothing's really simple. Yeah, last question, then I have to go.
So for us, when we hear our description of like us describing to see or hear, I wonder what's the difference between those for us. So what's coming to mind is like we have Nasiv and Ishmael, like we'll listen and part of Sinai, and then when the other thing that really kind of burns in my mind is when Avraham doesn't have to sacrifice Yitzhak and he passes his test. He says he names a place Hashem Yira. Maybe I'm getting okay, so that's the moment. So he says Hashem is seen then. So I want to understand how we mean hearing versus seeing.
This is a very, very important, very difficult, deep question. I've thought about this many, many times. I described a project which I think would be a wonderful project. Just like to take Chumash. There are certain things which you are told to see. Now, other things we're told to hear, although the word to hear means to understand also. To be tricky, you have to be careful about when you use it. Lishmo in biblical Hebrew also means to understand. And there are some things you're told to see, some things you're told to hear, and there are some things that you're told to both see and hear. That's 3 categories. It would be a fascinating study to first of all collate all of them, make lists of what they are, and to try to find some element, or some common element in for each of the 3 categories, how they relate to one another. I think that would be a great, great study. Someone like Rav Hirsch would have to do something like that. You have to have encyclopedic knowledge of all the places where there are all the commentaries and everything else. But I think it's a very, very important. The Achdus HaBorei, the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is said of both hearing and seeing. Both hearing and seeing. And Ha'azinu, it's Re'eh, Ki Ani Ani Hu, Ve'eni Eli Madi, and Shema, it's in the Kriya Shema, it's Shema. So I don't have a good answer to your question. There's a chinas that I could say here and there, but it's a fascinating, fascinating category. It should really be done.
Have a great night.
Thank you very much.